Welcome so much. Thank you. And I'll turn things over to Gretchen.
Thank you so much, Amelia and AASA and Public Interest Rate Privacy Center. I will just get down to brass tacks. Why are you listening to a lawyer about AI? Well, F3 Law, we're an education law firm. We just work with school districts. My practice is dedicated to education technology. We also have one of the largest special education practices in the country. So we are really passionate about partnering with school districts and schools and making sure they have safe practices in place and helping with your policies and your procedures. But as an education technology attorney, I go to tech conferences all the time and education conferences, and I am wowed by AI, just as many of you are, the impact it may have on education. And it's phenomenal. But the one thing I'm not seeing at the conferences is who is helping these school districts evaluate these tools for safety and for legal compliance. And so that is my objective today, is to give you really practical tips on how you all can evaluate the AI tools that may be presented to you or you're already using in your school system. I have like 5 safety tips. I'm trying to give you really practical information. Unfortunately, I'm not going to wow you with the really sexy demos of AI. I hope you already know how incredible it is. I encourage you to go out there on ChatGPT and give it a whirl. But I really want to make sure that we give you all some practical takeaways here today. And we have 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. And I really encourage you all to ask questions. It's a really hot, quickly evolving topic. It's summertime right now. It's a great time to get your policies and your procedures in place. So next school year, you can make sure that you have guidelines for your staff and your students. As Amelia mentioned, this is the third in a series of webinars. The first one was really how to vet your contracts, your terms and conditions, your software agreements. The second one was about threat monitoring. And today we're focusing on special education. But I know many of you on this call, you may be special ed administrators, but we have lots of superintendents and general administrators on the call too. So I'm going to talk both about special education emphasis, but there's a lot of general education implications here as well. And if there's something specific you don't get covered, my email address is right here on the cover slide. Please do not hesitate to reach out. We practice across the US and we're happy to support you. So with that, I'm just going to dive in. The first thing that I explain to some school districts and school boards is that a lot of times they talk about how can we get prepared for AI to come. Well, you all probably already know this. AI is already here. A lot of the software you're already using has been updated to incorporate artificial intelligence. When you go to sleep at night and you put your phone on the charger and you wake up in the morning and it says there's been an update, but you really don't know what's changed. Well, it can be that, there's AI. Google has an AI assistant now. Zoom has an AI assistant. A lot of your business operations software that you're using has a AI capability, and same with your education software. So that's what we're talking a little bit about today, is to the extent that your students are engaging with AI or your staff is engaging with AI, what kind of protections do you need to have in place? So yes, these examples of AI already in our everyday lives. I laugh when I get in my car and my navigation system says it's only 4 minutes to the grocery store, even though I didn't ask to go to the grocery store. My car just knows where I like to go and how far it is and the traffic. That's all AI. Your emails, where it finishes your sentence for you, that is AI. It's collecting information from you about your patterns and making, predictions on how you're going to use the technology. So we'll get into some real clear examples here, but it's not about AI is coming. AI is already here. So we're going to talk both about what you need to do about evaluating new tools and the tools that are already in place to make sure that they are safe and follow legal requirements. So the focus today is on special education, and you all may have examples that I haven't yet covered or encountered. And during our Q&A, I would love to hear maybe more examples of how AI is impacting special education. So where we have seen it is that there may be a parent with an accommodation request for their students. They may want to use a note-taking tool. The AI note-taking tools are phenomenal. Basically, it records the meeting, it collects information from the meeting in real time, and then organizes your notes and sends a summary or a transcript to the attendees. However, the information being shared may be privileged or confidential, or it may be a student record with a heightened level of protection. So when you have an accommodation request to use a note-taking tool for a student, we need to look at those terms and conditions and see if the data is being reshared or not. And we're going to talk more about that in detail. We're going to talk about whether parent permission would be required. But note-taking tools is one example of where we're getting accommodation requests. We also see the same note-taking tools come up where people try to record meetings. And just as Amelia started this meeting, she gave you all a notice it was being recorded. In many states, it is illegal, it is actually criminal, to record somebody without their notice. It's old-fashioned eavesdropping or wiretapping. You're really not supposed to be recording people without their notice. And so what we've seen happen is we will go to a special education, a confidential settlement conference where there's a parent and we're trying to settle a dispute, and they have recorded the meetings where they didn't notify anybody or they didn't see the pop-up message. And afterwards, there's a transcript that's produced. There's a couple issues there. One is, the transcript isn't always accurate. AI does not always produce accurate information. If it doesn't know the answer, it's called what hallucinates. It will create an answer. So in the legal field, if it doesn't know a case name, it will just make one up. So there's issues about accuracy. And when you're using note transcriptions from meetings, that's a particular concern we have. So sometimes we get parents who want to use meeting transcripts and submit it to OAH, the Office of Administrative Hearings, if there's a special ed dispute, and we generally object to that as they're not always accurate. They may be biased. They're not perfect. So, you need permission before you can record something. Not permission. You need to at least provide notice before you can record somebody. You need to check any sort of transcript for accuracy, for bias. It also can violate a privilege. So an attorney-client privilege communication, you're not supposed to share that content with a third party. Well, that third party might be your AI note-taking tool. So again, those note-taking tools, we need to be really careful and evaluate, is the data being reshared with a third party? When are we using them? And this is something that your special ed staff should be made aware of. If they have a parent requesting to record a meeting, that's fine as long as we take a look at who it's being reshared with. Are we violating the student's rights in resharing that data? So the big area where we're seeing AI being used and encouraged is, not encouraged by me, but encouraged by the software providers, is the creation of IEPs, individualized education plans for special education students. There is wide sweeping budget cutbacks. We understand there is a strong need for more efficiency for teachers and special education staff to do their jobs. A concern we have with using AI, artificial intelligence, to create an IEP is that many of our AI tools are what is called open generative AI. And I use ChatGPT just as an example. The free version, what it does is you put in a prompt, which may be, I need to draft an IEP about this student, and here's their goals and objectives, and here's their disability status, and here's some medical information. Please generate that IEP, and it will draft it. And both the content that you have inserted into that open AI tool and what it has created for you as a draft IEP is used to build up its knowledge base. It's used to make that tool smarter and repurposed and reshared with the universe. If somebody else across the world is creating an IEP with similar content, it may learn from that. The concern there is student data is protected under federal laws, FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. There's many laws that protect student data. So if you have staff that are using open generative AI to create IEPs, they may be violating students' privacy rights if they are using their name, their disability status, their medical information, So we need to be very careful that the use of open generative AI for IEPs needs to be completely anonymized. We do not want to violate anybody's rights or confidentiality by using open generative AI. So some school districts will say to their special ed staff, you can use it to create goals and objectives, but don't include any personalized information. And then again, you need that second layer of review to make sure it's accurate and free of bias and things of that nature. So these are areas where we have seen it be used as a tool to be more efficient for staff. We've seen parents request it. We've seen it used to record meetings and, submit transcripts to OAH. But, especially in the accommodation area, I gave the example of note taking, but I'd love to hear from you all when we get to the Q&A part later about where you may have seen open generative AI be used as an educational tool for special education students, because I know it has many, many applications, and it's and we all learn from one another, and we learn every day because we need to anticipate for next school year how it may come up and how we evaluate those tools. So I mentioned today's focus is on special ed, but especially for the administrators in the webinar, I just want to mention that AI really impacts all areas of district operations. Often, I hate to say it, special ed staff that's on the call, that's a group that's often overlooked. So when we are evaluating AI tools, they often say, well, send it to the IT guy. Or gal, of course. But it's your business office or your technology team. It can be your staff, your labor union. And I mentioned special ed. There's all kinds of stakeholder groups that need to be at the table when you are deciding what does your AI policy look like, or your guidelines, or your expectations of use for AI in the classroom. So all of these groups, and I can give you a few examples. So the business office, there's many business applications. Some school districts use it to process payroll. I'm like, well, are you putting staff's personal financial information in there? Is it being reshared? Those are questions you need to be asking. I've seen it used for bus routing, especially with a special education team. You could see, like an Uber app, the benefit if you can actually track in real time where your student is located. That's great. There's a great safety aspect to that, but convenience. But on the other hand, it's geolocation tracking of a child. Is there a privacy concern there? How is that going to be received by the parents? Well, I've worked with a school district that called me up, that the IT guy said, hey, we have a surveillance system that we want to take it to our board next week for approval. And this is a good example of the review process of how you review these tools. The IT director reached out and said, will you take a look at the surveillance system? We're doing a software upgrade for AI. And I said, okay, great, send me the contract. And he sent me one page. And I was like, this is just a one-page statement of work. There has to be more to it than this. He said, okay, let me ask the company. And it was a big, reputable company, and they sent over 90 pages. And the devil's in the details. I reviewed those 90 pages, but what I learned was, the benefit of the AI in the surveillance tool was that it could detect guns more so than the human eye, the shape of a gun. And so, of course, we want to stop school shootings. That was important. But it also it had license plate readers, it collected biometric data, and did facial recognition software. So every student coming onto your campus was going to have that level of data collected about them every single day, just in order for them to come to school and get their free and appropriate education. So I said to them, look, you need to think about how this is going to be received by your community, that you have this level of surveillance. I can make a legal argument of how you can navigate all of this, but there's also the public perception. And so when I talk about stakeholder groups, it's about probably your public information officer as well. Like, here's the benefit of using AI tools. It's safety. We're going to protect school shootings, and it's meant as a safety tool, but it also collects this level of information. The other kicker about that particular AI tool was that it was $9 million and had no termination clause. So if they didn't like it after a year, it was a 5-year agreement for $9 million. I said, well, you're still going to have to pay. Somebody needs to review these agreements. And that's one of our safety tips later on, is make sure your business office, your IT team, somebody's doing a thorough review of these terms and conditions before a district adopts these AI tools. So we talked about the business team, the technology team, special education team, district leadership. So sometimes it's your administration who wants to adopt an AI tool. We worked with the state of California, wanted to adopt a chatbot statewide for high school seniors to complete the FAFSA, the financial aid application. And it was great. It was an AI chatbot, and it said it had emotional intelligence. And I thought, I have a 17-year-old son. There's not a lot of emotional intelligence going on there. It seems like an oxymoron. So really, the concerns we raised there are, is this chatbot open-ended, or does it just talk about the FAFSA? And initially it was set up to be totally open-ended. And we thought, well, if it's having an emotionally intelligent conversation about with a student, what if they express self-harm? What if they say they're gonna, commit violence at the school? What is a school district's level of responsibility? Is there any monitoring of this tool? I mean, especially if the school districts are the ones putting it, doling it out to the students. So again, if you have an interactive chatbot, that's one of the features you'd want to look at is there any threat monitoring? Because, we have a duty of care to our students. If we are providing them software that they are engaging with, and we have the capability to monitor them, many school districts want to make sure they have that monitoring process in place so that we can prevent any harm to students and at the same time prevent liability for the school districts. So I'll get a little bit into more detail about threat monitoring and recommendations there. And then of course, students are using AI, and this is an area where I know it's overwhelming to hear all about all the potential legal liability. Again, the next piece of this is how to do it in a really practical and efficient way. So I don't mean to overwhelm you, but we also need students to be future ready learners and a future ready workforce. So to deny them AI tools, may be doing them a disservice. So we need to find that balance of how we can implement AI tools in a safe and responsible way, but also not set our students up where they're, cutting corners and not learning anymore because they're just generating essays using ChatGPT or something. Staff, there's a lot of staff issues, and the labor unions are another group that you may want to have at the table as you are evaluating the district's policies, procedures, practices on AI, because I work with a really large district that uses a AI software platform. Brace yourselves for this one. They just feed all the job descriptions in the entire school district into AI to tell them which positions can be eliminated and replaced with AI, or which job duties can be replaced with AI. Well, you can imagine that the labor union might have some issues with that. Also, teachers are able to generate lesson plans now in the blink of an eye using generative AI. And so that really goes into, their paid prep time. If you can do something in 30 seconds that used to take you 3 hours, does that change their working conditions? Is that something that you're obligated to bargain? So, something that we definitely, if staff are using it to create lesson plans or sub plans, I mentioned earlier the importance of accuracy and bias. So you always have to have a human go back and see what OpenAI is generating to make sure that the quality of the content aligns with curriculum standards. Another one I should mention that comes up a lot is translation services. Same thing. I mean, it's fabulous if we can have documents translated into your school community's first language or primary language. But we need to make sure that it's culturally sensitive, it's not biased, that it's free of errors. So even though you can use AI to translate documents, you still, if possible, should have a human doing a final review of that. So again, these are all just examples of AI really impacting all areas of a district cabinet and your district areas of district operations. So when we talk about how to create policy towards the end of this discussion, we can make sure that you include all these groups because they all have an interest in using AI in different ways to do their jobs or in the school community. So, thing I haven't mentioned is the big fear factor. And so, there's a whole spectrum of beliefs on AI, and you all have to navigate that. You may have school board members who just read things in the news about AI taking over humanity and causing another world war and, deep fakes. We absolutely have seen it where school children, middle school age students are creating nude images of their classmates that are completely fake. It is a real danger. So I understand why people are scared of AI. But on the other hand, we talked about the importance of future ready learners and the ability to, school district operations to be more efficient. So how do we strike that balance? I think it's exactly what we're doing today. Let's think about what some potential red flags are, put some guardrails in place to ensure that we have safe tools. And so, as far as deep fakes, we had another example where some kindergarten teachers were reading a book online to their students. They recorded it on their website, and somebody else took their audio and regenerated it with AI and made it into pornographic language. I mean, that is horrible. So what can you do? You need to have policy language to hold these people accountable for misconduct. Let's say it's the students, and you can track it down. You need to hold them accountable, and you need to adopt AI tools where they proactively prohibit nudity or obscenity, or you can contact them quickly. Has anybody ever tried to contact a social media company, for example? It's nearly impossible. So, making sure you have AI tools that will take responsibility for responding efficiently, quickly, and removal of any inappropriate content is a real benefit to the AI providers that you're working with, especially if they're AI providers who want to be in the educational space. We all know there's the potential for misconduct. So making sure we have the ability to go in and respond to it efficiently so we can minimize any damage that might come out of misconduct. And another point, I was going to make this later on, but I'll just say it here, is many school districts and many states have digital citizenship curriculum that is required already. And it has to do about things like dangers of social media and responsible use of technology in the classroom. It has not yet been updated to address AI. And the one piece of AI is helping people understand and identify misinformation. We all know, anybody who's on social media, like 50% of the posts I see these days are I can tell they're AI, they're completely fabricated. But how students learn to be skeptical or validate resources, or, just that you can kind of tell when they're robotic and automated sounding, that, don't believe everything you see, might need to be embedded into that digital citizenship curriculum. Okay, so moving on to the safety tips, getting down to the brass tacks. If there's one thing you could take away from today's webinar and take back to your team, your staff, and your students, is simply no PII. Do not put personally identifiable information into open generative AI. And open generative AI, I'll just say it again. Basically, there's different ways that AI can be in your school system. It is either a AI tool that you may likely purchase in this case, that's a closed walled universe. The content that is generated, created, submitted just stays within the walls of your school system. But a lot of the AI we see and hear about is what's called open generative AI. You can, and the technology folks on this call know this more eloquently than I do, but I'm trying to put it in the most basic terms. It's, again, you have the ability to input content and it will generate an output for you. So I could put in, my birth certificate and say, write a story about the life of Gretchen Shipley. Well, I just put my birth certificate into open generative AI. It is now shared with not only the AI company, but it can be regenerated and shared with the universe. And so, that's my private confidential information. I shouldn't have done that. So same with IEPs, same with a student's educational record, their grades, their transcripts, even their work product, it may have their PII in there. So that is a tip you need to tell your staff and your students. No personally identifiable information should go into open generative AI. The second safety tip is your school system should have a process in place to review contracts. You should be reviewing all contracts, right? So, but terms and conditions, utilizing software where you accept those terms and conditions, that's a contract. That is an agreement between a school system and the software provider. These are the terms and conditions of use. This is what you're agreeing to. And that is where the devil's in the details. That is where it says, this is the data we're going to collect, and here's how we're going to use it. But, I have read those terms and conditions. So, you may have an internal system to review those agreements. You may send them to your legal counsel. I mean, that's what I do a lot of the times, or am asked to do. So those terms and conditions may say things like, we resell the data. We collect it from your students and we resell it. That's how we make money. or we do targeted advertising for your students. Well, reselling student data and targeted advertising are both illegal. There's also one that worked with a threat assessment software company. It was like one of those online counseling tools, and they used AI to counsel the students. It was really a chatbot counseling them. But anyway, it said you paid them to do counseling, and there was a threat assessment component, and it said, and we disclaim any responsibility if we fail to detect a threat or fail to report it to you. It's like, well, what good is your service? I mean, isn't that what we're paying you for? So again, just having a system where you vet the terms and conditions. Now, it's one thing to have the system, but you need to make sure your staff knows about it and that there's a protocol in place. So we do not want staff going to these conferences, these tech conferences, and they want to be innovative teachers, and I applaud that. We don't want them coming back and simply uploading new software in the classroom or new apps on the students' devices without having some level of review for safety. So if it funnels through your business office, your administration office, your tech office, or your legal counsel, whomever, but those terms and conditions should be reviewed. And one message we share with them is free isn't free. Sometimes they skip the review process because it was free software. And they think, well, I don't have to ask permission. It doesn't cost the district anything. Well, free can be the most dangerous kind because those companies have to make money somewhere. And that usually is when they are reselling the students' data or doing targeted advertising, which again are both illegal. So even your free software needs to be reviewed internally. And once you've done that review, you can make a whitelist. You can make a list of here are the tools we've reviewed that we've, blessed and think are safe to use in the school system and make it easier for your staff. But again, as you're setting up your policies and procedures, having a vetting process, a contract review process is something that we recommend. Third safety tip, this one's more for the business folks, but I mentioned earlier about your existing tools being updated and upgraded to incorporate AI. Some school systems are saying to their vendors proactively, you need to expressly notify us. Don't just sneak it in there and not tell us, because frankly, it can really change what you originally contracted with them to do. It can change the safety of the product you've purchased. So, asking them to proactively provide you notice and explain to you how this changes the data you're collecting and how it's being reshared. The fourth safety tip, this is where I was talking earlier about threat monitoring, and this comes up in a few different ways. So, and this is probably the biggest area for school district legal liability. And again, we're talking about the context of special education. This can be general education. We all know that there is a mental health crisis amongst youth today. And so it's wonderful that there's a lot of counseling tools online put out there for students. I mentioned a chatbot where students freely engage. It was supposed to be about the FAFSA. Now that tool, by the way, they did rein it in and limit it to the FAFSA, but other chatbots are out there. What is the school district's level of responsibility? If a student was to be using a counseling tool that was set up by their school system and said, I'm going to harm myself, and God forbid they go through with it, what are the parents going to say? Hey, school district, you had the ability, you gave them this tool, this outlet, and nobody picked up on this. Nobody contacted us. Nobody contacted law enforcement. So, what is the school district's duty of care? To monitor students and to monitor your network and to provide this level of threat monitoring. Because if there's a school shooting or something, for example, they're going to say, did the district know or should they have known? There's a case I worked on years and years and years ago where a student threatened to harm themselves. They told their teacher, but the teacher never told their parents. And sadly, the student took their life that night, and the parent they sued the school district, and it was a $10 million judgment because the district knew or should have known that student, acted out and said they wanted to hurt themselves. Well, that was 10 years ago. I mean, so, most importantly is protecting student lives, of course, but this is, we're talking tens of millions of dollars if there is a real threat and that a school maybe fails to identify and appropriately respond to. So I don't mean to scare you all. I'm just really trying to reiterate the importance of, if you are going to have counseling tools, that you look in the terms and conditions and see, do they offer threat monitoring? Who at the district do they contact? Do they have the ability to escalate it to law enforcement? What does the district's threat assessment team look like? Are they trained? A lot of times they just notify the IT person, and like the IT person may have no background in training on how to assess a threat and how to respond to it. Someone on the district's team I've worked with school districts where they're like, I get my phone, it rings every night. I don't have the bandwidth to do this all the time. So I simply don't answer the phone call. That's not helpful either. So again, having the ability, having a software system that does threat monitoring, and ideally you want to have what's called a human in the loop. You want to have someone that it will escalate to, that's a human, to evaluate the threat. Sometimes there was a movie that came out called Suicide Squad. Well, that just blew up every threat assessment tool, but it was a good example of how it needs to be sophisticated enough to differentiate between the name of a movie and a student actually using the word suicide. So having an effective threat assessment tool, that they ideally have a human in the loop, and that there is a protocol for them to contact the school districts or contact a threat assessment team or law enforcement, depending on the level of threat, because it's really an issue of, one, saving student lives, but also minimizing risk and liability. So, I bring this up in the context of AI, just because AI is really broadening the scope of students' interaction with computers and through chatbots or through these counseling tools. And so the district still has some duty of care to make sure that we are creating a safe environment for these children. So my last and fifth safety tip is, when do you need parental consent to use an open generative AI tool or an AI tool in the classroom for educational purposes? This is one that hasn't really been focused on, but I think is a really key component that all school districts need to be thinking about. So the bottom line is, if students are putting educational records, and I think that would be a book report, or they're drafting an essay for English class, using open generative AI, they're putting their educational record into open generative AI, and they are resharing it, that is when you're going to need parent permission. And I will explain why. Do a little legal demo. But it makes a difference if it's open AI versus closed AI. If it's closed AI, you have a tool that's not, the data that is created and captured is not reshared out of your school system, then you've limited the resharing, and parent permission is not necessarily required. And I will do a quick FERPA lesson. So the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, federal law written in the 1960s, well before we were even using computers, much less AI. It is still the primary student educational records privacy law. And the baseline rule of FERPA is, if you are resharing a student educational record, you need parent permission. And there's a bunch of exceptions. So one exception that is most often used with educational software is called the school official exception. The exception is, you don't need parent permission in order to use educational software that operates like a school official. So an example would be your student information system. Like, I'll use ARIES, for example. It collects all your students' attendance records. It collects your grades, your contact information. It stores all that data for the school. You don't need parent permission, because you'll never get 100% parent permission, and you wouldn't be able to operate your school system if you had to get parent permission. There's an exception for your data management system, because it acts like a school official. It's doing the job that, back in the 1960s was done as a school official. So that is, if you have educational software that serves as a school official, you don't need parent permission. That is the same rationale that applies to all your educational software. You have a learning management system. Maybe it's a leveled reading comprehension program, where you have an elementary school student who does a reading passage, answers prompts, it levels their reading. they're engaging. That is putting their educational record directly into that software. Well, that's a school official. They're actually learning. So that's okay. You don't need parent permission because there are two criteria in order to be a school official, to fall under that school official exception. The first is that the software has to have a legitimate educational interest in the student. So the learning management system has a legitimate educational interest, the data management system, legitimate educational interest. And then the second component is it limits resharing. So open generative AI, I don't know that it has a legitimate education. I don't know that ChatGPT has a legitimate educational interest in your students, and it certainly doesn't limit resharing if you're using the free version that is open generative AI. So that is why I believe that if you are putting student educational records into open generative AI, it falls back to that. It's not that you can't use it. It just falls back to that base. It doesn't fall into the school official exception. It goes back to the baseline rule, which is parent permission is required. And so if you require parent permission, are you really going to have, you might not get 100% permission in a classroom. So I don't know that it could be required curriculum. It's going to have to be a supplementary tool. Like you can do your research on this project. You can either use Google, you can go to the library, or you have the option to use open generative AI if your parent completed the permission slip. So what does parent permission look like? These are some key components. Explain to parents what is the benefit of this AI tool, explain what data is being collected, how it might be used, shared beyond a student's educational purpose. The lawyer in me always puts in a liability waiver. And, since we have the special ed team on this call, can the parent, let's say this is part of an accommodation request, can they consent? Can this consent be achieved within the IEP? Can there be an express, I don't practice special education law day in, day out, but to the extent that parents can give permission for particular tools, if all this other information is covered and you can have them sign off on an IEP, that may be a place where you provide that consent, but something worth exploring. But so I just wanted, my fifth safety tip again was evaluating when you need parental permission. And I know I am running long on time, so I kind of want to wrap this up and talk about 7 or 8 really, as you go to evaluate your AI policy, what are some key things you need to be taking into consideration? Is the AI tool equitable? Is it available on different types of devices? I mentioned a chatbot for phones. I mean, not every student has a phone. Is it available on a website? Is it available on their one-to-one device? Is it available to students with disability? Does it meet ADA standards? We talked about bias. We talked about accuracy. These are all things that, in your policies or in your guidelines, you need to make sure that your staff is checking for. I mentioned, all the data privacy issues. So doing that contract vetting procedure for data privacy, making sure that there's safe tools for students. Do permission for student use. A lot of school districts are putting language in there saying open generative AI may not be used in the classroom to complete assignments unless expressly permitted by their teacher. So it can be used on a case-by-case basis for particular assignments. I mentioned earlier, labor unions evaluate whether it's a duty to bargain. Make sure you include a prohibition on misconduct, because if there is anything like deep fakes that we talked about, you want to make sure that you can hold students or staff accountable by prohibiting misconduct. So, we have sample policies that we've created and sample guidelines we're happy to work with you on. I kind of want to explain to you from a legal perspective, the type of work we do in this area, whether you all want to contact us or work with your own legal counsel, but we work on policy review for staff and students, or creating of these guidelines, helping your team navigate it. We do that contract review. We review all those terms and conditions. We really focus on student data privacy compliance, and we provide the trainings, whether it's for your board or your students, your staff. And then one quick segue, as long as I have all these administrators on the call, I wanted to let you all know, this is not about AI, but there was a very recent Supreme Court case. This is about ed tech, which is, my practice area. There's a recent Supreme Court case that changes a school administrator and a school board's ability to use social media and impacts their free speech rights. And our firm was at the US Supreme Court. We drafted one of the briefs, and it was a unanimous decision in support of school board members and in support of school officials. But again, it changed the rule nationwide for how you engage in free speech on your social media. So that is something that we're also happy to help anybody with, or you can find more information on our website. And I really want to turn it over to Amelia so we can try to squeeze in some questions. I apologize, I ran a little long.
All good. Thank you, as always, Gretchen. Really appreciate it, and thrilled to have you here. So, just a couple questions to start. Can you talk a little more about some of the potential civil rights concerns associated with using AI, such as accessibility requirements, and how to address or to mitigate those?
So one of the big civil rights concerns, I mentioned it so briefly, was equity and access. So already, just with traditional websites, there is a big movement to file complaints with the Office of Civil Rights for lack of access. A big area is visual impairment. And so when school districts, that's part of this vetting process, they said review those terms and conditions, do an ADA compliance check. There's really actually tools out there that can run a compliance check. And so that would really minimize the district inadvertently adopting a tool that is discriminatory against people with disabilities and might infringe on their civil rights. And then, if you do it, let's say accidentally or inadvertently, you can often work with the Office of Civil Rights to come up to speed and come up to code and enter into a resolution agreement with them. But that's probably the biggest area where we see civil rights infringed upon. Also, FERPA violations. If we are resharing students' data, that's another area of potential legal liability that we want to be really cautious and follow all the right protocols on, if we have engaged in a data breach inadvertently, what are, the responsive steps to notify parents and let them know that that took place.
Wonderful. Let's go ahead and keep having folks put in questions here. Looks like we're getting a lot. So let's see. We'll start with, should we ask that our teachers not use AI when developing an IEP? So what are maybe the more specific boundaries around what might be okay and what might not be?
I would recommend that it depends on your district's, every district's different. Every school system's different. I would either say no open generative AI to create IEPs. Do it the old-fashioned way. If you are going to permit open generative AI, or you suspect they're going to do it anyway, no personally identifiable information. You may have to explain to them that putting in PII will violate their students' privacy rights and cause a liability for the district. And, could be disciplinary action against them, frankly, if you have a built out policy and guidelines saying that they should not be resharing students' personally identifiable information. So that was, should you say no? I mean, that is one approach, open generative AI. Now, I believe there are tools being created by software companies that are a closed environment. I haven't evaluated those particular tools. So that's part of your vetting process. If you're working with a software company that says all the information stays within the school system, that may be okay. The real concern is the open generative AI and personally identifiable information, but also disability status, medical information. There's lots of sensitive topics in there.
And Gretchen, would love to have you weigh in on this. One thing I've heard related to that is the idea of using AI as the template in a way. So IEP for ADHD student or something like that, where you get sort of a more general, like, here are different ways you could phrase this or things that are online without entering any additional information about the student. Now, would that be safe,
Yeah,
or where are the boundaries there?
absolutely. So drafting goals and objectives. I mean, as long as you're not using personally identifiable information. And one thing that's really interesting is that doesn't mean just the student's name. So I've worked on cases where we were doing an investigation and it named the high school and it said she was a star swimmer and that she was of Polynesian descent. I was like, that pretty much identifies, that really limits a student. You might not have used your name, but I think you just identified that student. So again, goals and objectives. Using it as a template is fine as long as it's not personally identifiable information. And I don't just mean their name. It can't list, who their teacher is and what their diagnosis is, to such a degree that it's really, they're a student in a wheelchair with this disability, and there's only one student with a wheelchair in that particular class. So again, I think it's part of the training for your staff about you can use it to draft goals and objectives as long as it's completely anonymized and there's no PII.
Great. Really quickly, a couple other questions here. Is parent permission required for all ages in K-12? Only those under 13? Would notifying parents be adequate, such as in a first day packet, or do we really need a parent to sign off their approval?
So this is totally new under the law. It really goes back to FERPA, which again, written in the 1960s, so bear with me. 18-year-old students can sign their own permission. To give parent permission for a student's educational record to be reshared, personally, I don't know that it's sufficient to put it in your back to school packet unless you are listing we use these particular tools and here's the link to their terms and conditions and you give your permission. It is yet to happen that somebody has challenged or said there's a FERPA violation because parent permission wasn't acquired. But the baseline rule is you need parent permission before you can reshare student information. So I don't know how you just do a blanket one at the beginning of the school year or do it as an opt-out model, but I think this is starting to come back around. I just heard this week there is a full grand jury investigation about AI and data privacy happening, at least right now in Southern California. So I would err on the side of class by class basis. Here's a tool we want to use in this classroom and get parent permission. I mean, the more express consent you get, the more protected you will be.
Great. And our last question, is it enough for staff to uncheck the box to improve the model for everyone else in their settings and tools like Chat GPT? If this is unchecked, does it create a secure closed architecture if dealing with PII or any other employee information?
So, and I don't know exactly what they're asking, but I think what they're getting at, and one thing I maybe didn't mention, is that many of the tools are finally picking up on this resharing issue. Now, these software companies do not design their products necessarily, or at least initially, for students or for the K-12 space or for people under 18, or that educational records are a protected type of record. So what we're seeing now is many of the software company are putting a privacy switch. So you can change it from open generative AI to private, where it is limiting the resharing. And so as you're reviewing these tools, as you're vetting their terms and conditions, that is one of the questions that your team should be asking. Is it open generative AI? If it is there a privacy switch that can toggle it from open to closed? Or is it completely closed? So I definitely would recommend if you are concerned about resharing of student data or any personal data and you have the ability to flip the switch to make it private, that's going to keep the data, more localized and more central and make it a safer product.
I'll just add on to that practically. As someone who tried to do this in a more privacy protective way as I was playing with the tool, it has a tendency to delete your response when you do not select improve the model for everyone else, because ChatGPT is trying to get you to agree to improve the model for everyone else. So you may end up having teachers who uncheck it and then recheck it because otherwise it does not save their prior entries. And so just be aware that while that's a lovely safeguard, practically you're going to have a lot of staff that may go rogue there in order to deal with the incentives. So
in bottom line, I know this has probably been like a scared straight program. I'm not discouraging innovation. I really realize how important it is to have future ready learners and staff that can do their job more efficiently. We just want to create awareness so that you all can implement guardrails, practices, procedures that if they're using open generative AI, they have provided notice, they have gotten permission. They have been clear about what data is being shared and, or collected and how it's being reshared, just to protect the district from a liability standpoint.
All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming and joining this presentation today. We'll send out the presentation and the link to the recording later on this week. Gretchen, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And we hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so
Thanks for
much.
joining me, and please don't hesitate to reach out.